And hello, I'm Steve Oldfield. Many of you know me from the Public History Department at NKU. I'm teaching a class this fall. Prior to that, and really starting in high school, I worked in television news. I began at a public access facility, and we'll talk about that a little earlier, all the way up through network reporting on Denver, Richmond, Detroit, Salt Lake, Orlando, Miami, New York, LA. Through that time, from the 1980s to today, we have seen a real revolution in television news and in documentary filmmaking and in really the democratization of that whole industry. Think about what it was like 25, 30 years ago to make a piece of television news compared to today when most people can use their cell phones and record something that could actually work in television. So we're going to begin by talking about really the beginnings of video journalism and documentaries and newsreels all the way up to today. And I would argue that all of that starts actually with the greatest impact was during the Civil War and Civil War photography. There are quite a few photographers who made big names for themselves photographing, as you see in this PowerPoint, a soldier killed at Gettysburg. On the other side, there are mass groupings of soldiers. This was powerful imagery, and imagery that really kind of brought home what war was like. And that started that whole kind of photojournalism movement of kind of being able to show what the world was really like in photography. Well, ironically, right before that time, if you look at any of the old beautifully done lithographs and other kinds of etchings and drawings, they had made it almost photoreal. It was at the height of that movement. But the moment that the camera came, and it wasn't drawn from somebody's mind and their own impressions, but was the real deal, even the worst Civil War photography made a bigger impression than these beautiful lithographs of the time and the beautiful etchings and other kinds of drawings that were in magazines. From that came the birth of radio, as you know, and the moving picture at the same time, and then upwards into talkies. There were famous radio broadcasts talking about wars in the early 1900s, and from that moved a thing called the newsreel. A lot of times we forget before television. My mother, for instance, who's now in her late 80s, said that they went to the movie theater pretty much every day, if not 3 or 4 days a week. And before the actual movie would start, they would watch a newsreel, which was a little film that was telling them the news of the day. It had everything from news on the war, or other events going on, to a story as simple as the Boy Scouts of America. Here's an example of an early newsreel.
Today, the Boy Scout Manual is the handbook for democratic youth the world over. More than 10 million copies have already been sold. It is a guide for the Boy Scout who, one night each week, assembles with his troop to reaffirm his own oath and to administer it to any new member.
On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country, and to obey the Scout law, to help other people at all times, to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight.
Tiniest members in the Boy Scout organization are its cubs, who, at the age of 9, think of themselves not as moppets, but as grown-up Boy Scouts. The joys of cubbing are short-lived, for at 12 the cub must take upon himself more serious obligations. Every year, 300,000 young citizens, cubs who have reached the age of 12 and other recruits, become full-fledged scouts. Now the American boy finds that scouting centers around the experiences of outdoor life. In the Scout scheme of character building, there is no place for regimentation, no standard pattern to which every boy must conform. But first principle of the Scout movement is that the duty of the American youth is to improve his general knowledge and fit himself for the responsibilities of good citizenship. Week after week, the Explorer Scout returns home with a new sense of self-reliance and a new appreciation of the world in which he lives.
Okay, so what we notice here about these early newsreels, if you've ever heard of or seen A Triumph of Will, which was Hitler's famous propaganda film, the way they talk about the Hitler Youth is not much different than the Boy Scouts were talked about there. So all sides, whether it was the Germans or the Americans or the English or the Japanese, they were all trying to harness this new media and use it to their potential. You could teach a whole class on propaganda films of World War II, and it would be a fascinating class. The thing that they all had in common, and that was part of that early system of news broadcasts, is that they always had the all-knowing narrator, who in many cultures, as you might assume, was the strong white male who was telling you what it was and what it is. You'll notice in that Boy Scout story, we didn't hear from one single Boy Scout. And if that were a news story you were seeing today, you might hear or see the reporter for a few seconds, but most of the story would be told through the mouth of a scout, or maybe even a scoutmaster. Back then, in these early newsreels, most of it was just a narrator telling you how to think. And that also reflects really the time, because people at home, maybe they had a Brownie still camera, or maybe they had an early film camera, but people weren't putting together their own newsreels to be shown. That was all controlled by the most powerful movie companies, and in many cases Time Life Books, if you're familiar with them, and Time Magazine and Life. Those big publishing houses were controlling the message and getting out those newsreels. If you go to YouTube and you Google March of Time, you'll see a lot of those early newsreels, and they're great to watch. Just past that time in the 30s, we started getting our first news celebrities, people who were the voices and the faces of the news. Edward R. Murrow was famous for his war broadcasts on CBS. He made the transition into television, and he started doing interviews. The first set of interviews were with the very wealthy people. See It Now, and he would do live reports where you would go inside Alfred Hitchcock's house, or you would see John Wayne at his home. From there, things started becoming more democratic. By the time Walter Cronkite was the head of CBS News, they were starting to do many more stories about the average person and the average poor person. In the 1960s, they followed Bobby Kennedy, for instance, when he went traipsing through Appalachia, spending a lot of time right here in Kentucky talking about the poorest of the poor. CBS News went along and turned those into mini documentaries. This was also a time that many might say was the golden era of television, because, as you see, Walter Cronkite on the cover of Time magazine was considered the most trusted man in America. Would we ever call a news person of today in 2013 one of the most trusted people in America? I doubt it. And most TV news today is nothing like it was when it comes to quality during Walter Cronkite's time. So now it's time for a little bit of my personal history. I started watching Walter Cronkite when I was 4 years old. Back then, most households only had one television set. That's how ours was. And after the family would sit down and have dinner, we would watch the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. I was either told I could run out and play outside, but I had to sit there quietly if I wanted to and watch the news. As a consequence, I grew to really respect Walter Cronkite and loved being informed. And I'll never forget, I was 9 years old during Watergate, and a reporter at CBS News did a joke story. They said, let's talk to kids and see what they think Watergate is. And one of my peers at the time, who was 9, did a whole surmising that Watergate must be something to do with something firefighters used to put out fires that were burning in yards. There were all kinds of idiotic answers about what was a Watergate, was it a fountain? And all these adults were laughing, ha ha, our kids are so poorly informed at the biggest story of the day. I knew all the players in Watergate. I watched all the hearings. I could tell you the names of all the reporters, all of the people on all the sides, and I was mortified that my peers weren't like that. That also was the first time I thought, you know what, maybe I'm a little different than your average kid with this news fascination. And the moment I could, I signed up to learn how to be my own broadcaster. Back in the early days of cable television, which was just starting in the 80s. Remember, before that, it had just been all over-the-air broadcast submissions, and a lot of them were very bad. If you watch old movies, you'll see people kicking or hitting a TV in order to try to get better reception. A lot of people had these crazy antennas, rabbit ears, or all these things that they were trying to use to get a better signal. Now, all of a sudden, cable has come in, and you're guaranteed a perfect picture. But in order to get the access to the American homes, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, put some stipulations on cable companies. And one of them was they had to offer what was called local origination and public access programming. The thing that would be locally like CN6, and if you have been here for many years, you remember the old guy, Don Weber, who used to do the local sporting events and things like that. That was local origination programming, paid staff of the cable company who were covering the local community. They also were supposed to offer something called public access television. The most famous spoof on public access television, of course, is Wayne's World. And the guys from Saturday Night Live, they even made movies about it. Well, the Wayne's World crowd were making a fun, zany variety interview show. I and my friends were out creating our own little news show. And we went all around the area. My first story was on a parimutuel rider named Elmer Conrad. I covered the ventriloquist convention at the Drawbridge Inn, which I believe they still have today. It's an international convention every year. I also did a story on battered women and talked to the person who ran a battered women's shelter in Newport, Kentucky. So I was putting together my own newscasts. And again, that was before people had their own handheld handy cams or cell phones. This is what those first early cameras looked like. You had a separate giant camera, and then that thing on his shoulder, that was used to carry the giant tapes that would record the video and audio. And it was called 3/4-inch videotape. From there, it progressed to something called beta tape and the Sony Betacam. But again, just take a look at how big one of those Betacam tapes were. Huge and heavy. And again, they were taped. They could wear out. There could be a problem with it. It was all before the age of digital. The other thing about that was that Betacam you're looking at right now on the left of the screen, that typically would cost a TV station $50,000 to $70,000 for one setup. And then to edit it, the editing machines are on the right. Those were $30,000 to $40,000 each. So for one camera and one editing system, you're looking at easily $120,000 to $130,000. If you were going to be a news operation with 10 cameramen and 10 editors, just do the math on what that cost to get that up and running. So once again, it was only big corporations, big media companies that could afford to have the tools to tell the stories of America. That was long before the average person could create such a thing. The technology kept getting smaller and smaller. We went from that to digital video, which was a huge improvement. The cameras were lighter. Suddenly, instead of being $70,000 or $50,000, you could get a decent camera for $3,000 to $5,000. The tapes were much smaller again, but they were still tapes. And that, again, was a time when it was cheaper to do television news, but it still wasn't the average person. When we started having smaller camcorders, the quality wasn't that great, and you could still see the difference between a professional and an amateur. And back in those days, if you were going to do a documentary that you hoped would be at the Sundance Film Festival and maybe get a run on public television somewhere, again, that was before a million channels that would show that kind of content. I interviewed people at the Sundance Film Festival who literally had their parents mortgage their houses to pay for their film. Because as you might imagine, film was so expensive and requires so much film to make a documentary. It would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do a documentary. And usually the only kind of documentaries that ever were finished were ones that were profiling famous people, and somebody could get funding to do that. There were early documentaries on Bob Dylan and on the Beatles and those sorts of things, or an issue that people really cared about. Maybe it was some drug that they felt was causing women to have miscarriage, for instance, or birth defects, like DES, if you remember that. I once interviewed a woman who did a documentary on DES because she had to actually have a hysterectomy at the age of 17 because her mom had been a DES mother, took that drug in order to have the child, but then the child grew up to have all kinds of problems. So she felt so strongly about that issue, she did her own documentary on DES. And did whatever she could to get it paid for. But then around the mid-90s, as technology got cheaper and cheaper, suddenly the average person didn't have to mortgage their home or do anything like that, and they could do their own documentaries. They could start telling their own stories. They could do things that were powerful, that would have an audience, and they could have a message. And that message, again, wasn't just the omnipotent, know-it-all narrator. It was an average person telling you their story, and more importantly, turning that camera around and interviewing people and getting them to tell their stories. At around the same time, in the public history field, people started realizing we don't just need a cassette recorder to do these oral histories, we can videotape people. And Steven Spielberg was an early public historian, you could say, because he took all of the money that he made from Schindler's List and helped to start a foundation that ended up trying to record every Holocaust victim before they died. And that's another powerful thing you can Google online. Let's look at how the technology has improved today. This looks like an old still camera from the 70s, but it's not. It's a digital camera, and it also records video in one. And that's what we've been using for a lot of the work that Sean Thomas and I have been doing on the Battle of Augusta and other projects. It has a beautiful picture, and we only had to buy one camera. It shoots great stills, but it also does video. If you were also going to look for a camcorder to do a documentary or oral history, make sure you get one that has a mic input. And these little cameras now, like this, are more in the $300 to $400 range. You can get some even cheaper than that, but make sure it has a mic input, because you can get a mic at Radio Shack for $30 or $40 and the sound will be perfect. You could use the mic on the front of the camera, but it's going to sound more hollow and it's not going to be as good. So again, a Handycam versus a DSLR, and again, the DSLR is the one that looks like that. DSLR, you can use other lenses, have it be multi-purpose. The problem is it can overheat literally after 12 minutes, and if you're doing a long interview, that can be a challenge. The technology is getting better, so that doesn't happen as often, but that could happen on a lot of different cameras, whether it's a Sony or Canon or a Nikon. They're working again to improve that. Camcorders, you can run those for literally hours and not have to worry about it. And the other thing that I think is interesting is that when we think about these things, this was within my lifetime. This is a giant beta tape. This is what a professional camcorder thing looks like today. And think about a little SD card that's maybe even half the size of that. All of those things help make it so much easier to tell your story. And when I think about it, one of the big watershed moments when it came to personal camcorders and cell phones making a difference and being included in a lot of major news coverage was after 9/11. It wasn't 9/11 because, if you remember, some people happened to have camcorders out, but it wasn't the same thing with all those cell phone cameras. If 9/11 were happening today instead of 12 years ago, we no doubt would have had video and transmissions from inside the building, from those people on those upper floors talking to their loved ones. It would have been quite a different thing, and I'm sure much even more painful to watch than what we saw. But the event that actually really changed things and got TV news people thinking was the bombings in London that came after that. Some of them were down in the subway, A double-decker bus was also bombed. And if you remember, within seconds of that happening, cell phone camera video that was taken down in the subway and with those on those buses or near the buses was suddenly being transmitted all over the world. And if you logged into Yahoo, there it was. Or if you had YouTube, there it was. And that made people in the news business realize, wow, we're going to have to incorporate more of the average person, more of this YouTube video into our stories. And now you can hardly watch a newscast anywhere where they aren't showing you some video that somebody posted somewhere in the world. Many times it's video that is, look at what my cat's doing and some silly thing. But more often than not, a lot of the first footage that you see from a major news story happened because somebody had a camcorder or somebody had a cell phone camera. Okay, so if you were going to put together a story, I have a few things for you to think about. The first is nonlinear editing, and this was another sea change kind of development. In the old days of film, in the initial days of television, back when you had the beta decks and the tape decks, when you edited, it had to be in a linear fashion. You had a play deck and a record deck, and you literally moved stuff over, typically in sequence. But then in the 90s came nonlinear editing. And that's a system that you've probably heard of. Final Cut is the Apple version, Avid is another professional version, and Adobe Premiere Elements. Those are the three main things. Instead of piecing things from one machine to another, you suddenly had a timeline. The timeline had video 1, video 2. You could layer videos, you could layer your audio, and you could edit things out of sequence. So if you were to do an interview with somebody for a documentary, you would do all of your interviews first. Before you write the script, you find out the quotes that you want to use, what we call sound bites, and you lay those on the timeline first. You don't sit down and think, I'm going to write this story like you're writing an essay or like you're writing a book and put everything in order. You're putting the sound bites or the quotes first. And then all you have to do is write transitions that get you from one sound bite to the next sound bite to the next sound bite. And that, again, keeps you from having that kind of style like we saw in the old newsreel where it's just the narrator telling you the whole story. You're letting the people tell the story in the sound bites, whether it's an historian, whether it's somebody who knew the person that you're doing the profile on, or someone who witnessed an event. You're letting them tell the story, and then you're just narrating the parts that get you from one of the things that somebody says to the next, and those transitions. You can piece those in later. That's why we call it nonlinear editing. And again, that radically changed the world. And those systems, again, just like we were talking about how the camera prices went from $70,000 for a video camera down to something you could buy at Big Lots for $20 or $30. The editing systems that used to be $70,000, $100,000 are now only a couple $100, if that, and you can edit right on your computer at home. So those are some big differences. What are some tips I have? Tips from the front line that if you were going to try to get a job in the business. The interesting thing is, just like any other discipline in public history, you have to do your research. You have to know what's going on. Don't be afraid to ask librarians for their help and their referrals. Business cards, but always get their information. The tip there is always be looking for contacts. And if you interview someone, don't just have them give you a business card and not put their name and their title and the spelling of their name and how they pronounce it. Have them do that on the actual video. So when you begin every interview, we always say you slate it. So you would have them say their first and last name, how to pronounce it, how to spell it, what their title is. That way, if you lose that business card or that notebook, you still have the information. And then the final thing I'll tell you is send thank you notes. One of my favorite stories is when I was covering the Sundance Film Festival for the first year, I worked with Robert Redford's press assistant, a brilliant woman named Sandra. And Sandra was also pretty tough. And about 4 months after the festival, I had sent her a thank you note. I bumped into her at the airport, and she said, "Steve, there were more than 300 damn reporters at that festival, and you're the only one who bothered to send me a thank you note." The next year, she retired. So I thought, oh no, I had this great connection, but unfortunately, it didn't really go anywhere. Well, the good news is 8 years later, I was sitting at my desk then in Orlando, and I get a phone call. "Steve, this is Sandra. Remember me?" Well, of course you would remember Sandra Saperstein. And I said, "How are you?" She said, "Great." She said, "Do you still do stuff for the Fox Network feed?" I said, "Yes." She said, "We can fly in, I think it was 3 reporters to the Maui Film Festival. Would you like to cover the Maui Film Festival?" I said, "Well, yes, of course." And again, I can trace that all back to making a good first impression with a thank you note. So whether you're thanking your professors like Dr. Tenkati for their help, or some person who gave you an hour of their time to help you research a paper or research a documentary, or somebody who, went and got their hair cut, made sure they were wearing their best clothes, and booked time to do an interview with you. If people are going to take that time to grant you an interview for your oral history or for your documentary, you owe it to them to send them a handwritten thank you note. Not just an email, but a paper thank you note. And I will tell you, again, you are at an exciting time to be in public history, to think about doing documentaries and short videos for museums and historic sites, or even your friends or family. Because just think, 20, 30 years from now, you would have hired a crew that was walking around with, $100,000 worth of gear and charging you a lot of money to make those videos. Now you have the power to make all those videos, to tell those stories yourself for not much money at all. I would encourage you, if you have room in your program and in your classes left, to take the class that we teach on new media and documentary filmmaking. It's geared to the public historian, and we would love to share more of that with you. If you're looking for good examples of stories, again, if you go to YouTube and look up those old newsreels, that'll help. But also, every Sunday morning on CBS, from 9 to about 10:30, is a terrific show called Sunday Morning. And some of the best, I would call them public historians, but they're news people. They're doing all kinds of terrific stories that are well shot, well edited, well written, and they could give you some great examples of how to do this kind of work. So again, thank you for listening. I hope I didn't ramble too much. Thank you to Dr. Tenkati for having me as your guest. Feel free to contact me either on Facebook, Steve Oldfield, or part of the MAF program. And good luck with all of your projects.